would like to invite the editors of the case against academic boycotts of Israel, but first I'll introduce them. First, we'll have Professor Cary Nelson, who is a Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois, where he regularly teaches a seminar in Holocaust poetry. He served as national president of the American Association of University Professors, also known as AAUP, from 2006 to 2012. He's the writer or editor of 30 books and over 250 essays. He has been active in the movement opposing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions since 2006. Cary's op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many academic venues. He currently serves as co-chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the Third Narrative. Cary became a Schusterman Fellow in Israel Studies in 2014. After him will speak Professor Gabriel Nnoah Brahm. Gabriel Brahm is an associate professor of English at Northern Michigan University, a research fellow in Israel Studies at Brandeis University, and a Scholars for Peace in the Middle East Fellow. He is currently a visiting professor in the School of Philosophy and Religions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His presentation today is part of a book project titled Israel in Theory, the Jewish State and the Cultural Left. Professor Nelson, please join us.
Thank you all for coming out today. If I were home, I would thank you out for coming in the snow. So consider yourselves lucky. If I were home, there'd also be a few hecklers around here. My talk might be interrupted. So I'm glad to be amongst friends for a change where that is unlikely to happen, though I know how to deal with it if it does. You've heard some warnings about the growth of the boycott movement in the United States. You saw a very simple film, and the reason to see that, I think, is to understand that that represents, for the most part, the level of consciousness about the issues that inform many students and faculty in the United States. A few simple slogans, 3 words in a row, and that represents the level of understanding that really helps galvanize people. So don't dismiss it. You're looking at, in that little film, you're looking at human consciousness in the United States in all of its complexity over millions of years of evolution. I'm a strong believer that only a 2-state solution, 2 states for 2 peoples, offers a route to justice of a sort for both Israelis and Palestinians, and a means for both peoples to control their political destinies and perhaps to live side by side in peace. The first thing I ask of any political proposal is whether it supports that goal and what practical steps it offers to take us there. Well, if you saw the film, there are no practical steps. There are slogans. There's nothing to follow upon boycott. There's nothing that leads toward anything whatsoever. In talking with audiences, I look for rational arguments. I do not begin by offering an emotional appeal for either side. That practice, either dramatizing how small a country Israel is, how vulnerable its citizens on its borders are, how demoralizing and terrifying the suicide bombings were, I don't talk about that. Nor do I testify passionately to how traumatic the Nakba was, how wretched the lives of Palestinians in the refugee camps often are, how frustrating it is for them to face constant police surveillance, how galling the checkpoints can be when the flow of people have stalled, how counterproductive IDF policies like the destructions of homes are, how disturbing the images of dead children are. I take all of this as a given, as the realities of the situation. But most discussions of boycotts and of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the United States begin with a passionate appeal on one side or the other of that list, and that's where it's that kind of emotional appeal to an audience that's the ground of the discussion. If the standard entry fee for a campus discussion of the Arab-Israeli conflict is to work up the audience's sense of anger and injustice for either people, I'm going to disappoint you. I believe empathy for both peoples is critical to any viable solution for the conflict. But political and emotional agitation is not a useful contribution to the debate in the United States, although it's the main substance of the debate in the United States. I prefer cold reason directed toward achieving a just peace. A peace, of course, as you all know, in which both peoples must compromise. Pro and con campus debates about BDS or the Arab-Israeli conflict often amount to competing efforts to win people over exclusively to one side or the other with emotional appeals. And when there are campus debates on both sides, that's sort of what happens, and all it ends up with is greater passions and greater antagonisms on each side. I call that war by other means, war by linguistic means. It doesn't help anyone. It only serves to make BDS supporters here and abroad feel good about themselves. And it enhances that kind of emotional appeal, enhances the self-image of BDS advocates by convincing them they've signed on to a selfless cause. They feel better about themselves because they are now selfless. So why should this movement matter to Israelis? It poses no immediate threat to the Israeli state, and I think it deals in rebuttable lies and misrepresentations. It may seem, from your perspective, to be merely part of the nonstop propaganda war that Israel and its allies confront all the time. So does it merit special attention and concern? I think for many Israelis, BDS is really hardly even an American and European movement. It appears to be a West Bank phenomenon, to be understood in terms of the motives and rhetoric of its Palestinian provocateurs. So why single it out? Why give it special attention that in some ways enhances its self-importance and prestige and potentially shifts attention from more pressing military challenges? I think the first thing you have to understand is that BDS is not just a body of propaganda. As it has evolved on American campuses, it's become a movement. That means it recruits people not just to an ideology, but increasingly to multiple group relationships. Informal BDS group membership, you don't really sign up, provides reinforcing social relationships, participation in what amount to alternative communities, and a strong sense of involvement in a social and political cause. On campus, BDS advocates don't just go to meetings and lectures. They also join demonstrations. They participate in deliberate provocations. They socialize with other BDS activists. All of that whole mix of things, helps them see their human opponents on campus as enemies, as an other to be demonized. In addition to opposing Israel, they are allied against Israel's local supporters. And they're gradually causing those local supporters to stand down, to hide behind silence. For faculty in humanities departments, I belong to the worst discipline of all, which is English. Our book statistically shows that of people across the United States who have signed BDS petitions, 21% are in my field. Not the happiest fact for me. In any case, for people in departments where there's this strong percentage of faculty participation, BDS comes to be fused with their professional and disciplinary identities. Whether or not they actually participate in actions, they have a departmental BDS cohort, and they have interchangeable BDS professional relationships. And so BDS can eventually come to define collegiality for them. It's their professional identity. It's their cohort on campus. When they leave town to go to professional meetings, they will increasingly find BDS sessions to attend and possibly BDS resolutions to endorse. There are academic associations where you can attend BDS sessions all day long. That can be your entire experience for a couple of days, is listening to rallies against Israel that pretend to be academic presentations. So new sets of BDS relations are opened by this process, and a new national or international circle of BDS colleagues created. We're going to a drink after the BDS panel, want to come along. You're brought into a network of human beings, and you begin to ground your identity there. Some, of course, are therefore persuaded BDS should become their primary political cause, the center of their political life, and some become completely obsessed with BDS activism. At some point, some of these faculty conclude they have a moral obligation to promote and oppose Israel, promote BDS and oppose Israel, not only in campus forums and professional meetings, but also in their classes. We've passed the Rubicon in American higher education, where some BDS opponents, more of them than one would like to fear even, believe that their job in the classroom is to recruit their students to that cause. And I think, really, we haven't seen anything like that in any way comparable since the Vietnam War. It's a large shift in what it means to teach if instead of presenting views, you actually want to bring your students in line with your own political convictions. BDS recruits both students and faculty to a cause that claims simple justice as its motivation and goal. You saw that in the slogans in the film. Justice, equality. You don't have to think beyond that. You adopt the slogan and you voice it back. It's an illusion, but it's an illusion that people like to embrace, and an illusion that the left in America has a certain history of embracing. If you identify with that logic, it can present a call to action that trumps traditional value systems grounded in free inquiry and academic freedom. If you have God on your side, why should you grant the Israeli devil equal time? And of course, in the left in America, the Palestinians become absolute victims, people without agency, as though they were sort of angels descended from heaven and walking the earth without complex motivations. The left wants that sort of victim as part of its ideology. At its most effective, BDS can turn students and faculty into lifetime opponents of Israel. Now, if they lived in Transylvania, I don't know where that is, but I've heard of it, maybe it wouldn't matter. But the U.S., as others have said, is Israel's major international ally, and BDS is strongest at some of North America's most influential universities and liberal arts colleges. In New York, it's very strong at NYU. I'm not sure there's anyone else at NYU left except BDS activists. Incredibly strong at Columbia. On the West Coast, Berkeley is basically BDS central, a campus where alternative points of view are almost impossible to be heard. And that's spread throughout most of the California system, not just the University of California, but California state universities as well. It's a statewide political movement that has really gripped California. My own campus, BDS, is so powerful that the Jewish Studies program a couple of months ago decided, the Jewish Studies program, I'm a member, that they would no longer teach Israel as part of the Jewish Studies program. They've cast Israel out of the Jewish Studies program. There are a few Jews living in Israel, I've heard by rumor, but they're not. The study of that country is no longer part of Jewish Studies on my own campus. And when Israel Apartheid Week begins in March, there's a huge apartheid wall constructed across Central Campus. I've only looked at it once. I'm never going back to look at it again. But so there are campuses in the Midwest as well, campuses in Toronto, where BDS in many ways reigns supreme. So I think it has to be faced that some of these major universities and colleges I'm talking about are going to graduate the next generation of professionals, politicians, business leaders of all kinds, and eventually there will be consequences for that. I don't think BDS is a security threat today, but I really can't see with this trend how it doesn't become a security threat somewhere down the line. And at some point, you graduate enough students who have this conviction, and it begins to affect the institutions where they're employed, and I think potentially, eventually, government policy. Better to try to fight it now than to wait until it's too late. Obviously, BDS is not the same order of security threat as Hezbollah's rocket arsenal, but political and cultural challenges to Israel's right to exist cannot be ignored. Now, it's an external threat. It's a distant threat. There's only so much Israelis can do to combat it. Most of the fight needs to be waged in countries where BDS is working. There's not a lot you can do. Obviously, changes in Israeli policy will make a difference. BDS is a movement that's been affected by, it necessarily is affected by political events in Israel and throughout the Middle East. So if settlement construction east of the security barrier were to be curtailed, that would affect the BDS movement. Government policy in Israel changes, it can have some effect on the BDS movement. Now, I say the movement, and I draw a distinction between the thousands of students and faculty whose level of consciousness is no more sophisticated than that cartoon that you saw, and the leaders of the movement who are absolutely hopeless and are lost to reason and lost to the Jewish state. The leaders of the movement are in print repeatedly saying that nothing will satisfy them except the dissolution of the Israeli state. People like Omar Barghouti, Judith Butler, they say that in writing. It's not a mystery. It's not a supposition on my part. And nothing will influence them. But the ones who don't have any more complex thinking than that cartoon you watched can be reached by reason. They're accessible, and their feelings can be changed. Their convictions can be changed. Obviously, promoting visits to Israel by Americans young and old remains a highly effective strategy. The BDS movement tends to think of Israeli universities as abstractions. They're structures. No one actually teaches in them. No one studies in them. They're sort of devoid of people. But if you bring people here and get them to see a campus and realize that on some campuses there are really classes where Arabs and Jews work together, then it's a little harder to argue that one should boycott an abstract institution when you recognize that it's a place where real people work together and collaborate. Sometimes only Israelis can provide the hard facts necessary to counter BDS lies. And we often struggle to get facts quickly, since sometimes at professional meetings someone gets up and tells a falsehood, and you need the results in about an hour if you're lucky. So we desperately begin to call people in a kind of race against time. We need better contacts with Israelis committed to helping Americans, Canadians, Europeans getting information that they need as quickly as possible, if it exists. It doesn't always exist. Sometimes, record keeping is less than perfect. We knew early in 2014 that the fall would see enhanced BDS activity, but we did not prepare for the level of uncontrolled hatred we've faced since the war in Gaza. It has changed, and the level of hatred is tenfold what it was a year ago, and our job is very hard. For me, BDS was a part-time activity until about a year ago, and these days I seem to be doing it full-time. But it's nice to have a chance to do a little bit of it amongst friends. Thank you.